All right, so does anybody have any questions they want to ask before I begin my lecture for today? About any matters related to the course up till this point in time? All right, so what I'm going to do today is continue with the lecture that I commenced on Tuesday, and that is an overview with some analytical considerations, of course, an overview of the history of Indians in the United States, and then in subsequent weeks we'll move to more detailed discussions of certain aspects of that history, such as, for example, the religious life of Indians in the diaspora, the cultural forms that have arisen as a consequence of the Indian presence here. But let us go back to the kinds of considerations that I had begun with on Tuesday in the latter part of my talk, where I had started to describe to you the imagination of India in the US. Right? That before we really come to a consideration of such things as how the Indian population grew here, giving you something of a demographic, let's say, outlook, all the way from roughly around, let's say, the late 1890s, when you begin to get a small Indian presence here, down to the present day. But before we do that, I had suggested to you that what would be more productive in some ways, and if you've started reading my book, I mean, you'll notice that there's a short chapter where I begin to look at such things as what I'm calling the Indian imagination, right, in the United States. And I had pointed to the presence of a group of intellectuals known as the American Transcendentalists, right? Among them, the principal ones being Emerson, who is generally viewed, Ralph Waldo Emerson, as the founder of this school, and Henry David Thoreau, in some respects perhaps a better known figure, particularly because of his essay on the duty of civil disobedience and the book called Walden. And somebody like Thoreau was a representative, what is very often described as rugged Yankee individualism, right? So someone who expressed certain aspects of American culture that are viewed, or the American personality that are viewed in some respects as quintessential to the understanding of American history and the shaping of American culture, right? So that's one strand. And who were these people? They were people who were widely read, deeply interested in Indian texts. So Indian texts, when I say Indian texts, I'm referring to the Vedas, I'm referring to the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, which were beginning to be translated, beginning in the late 18th century. So the Bhagavad Gita, for example, was first translated around the late 1780s by a man called Charles Wilkins. And remember that India is at this point under colonial rule. So that's partly one reason why these texts are now becoming available to Europeans. And there are translations that are appearing in French and German as well. Right? So this is the scenario that I'm describing. Now, I had described very briefly, very briefly, another scenario, which I simply want to once again remind you of, and that is that the presence of Indians themselves in the United States, in fact, actually has a much earlier history, which goes back to the 18th century. And the scenario there is that we're talking about British aristocratic landed class. This is before the formation of the United States. Some of whom, these Britishers who come to India, come to the United States, they bring Indians with them on board, right? So what you have is a very small class of Indian slaves, effectively. And we don't really know much about them. We don't know anything about their history. The reason that we know there were slaves at all who might have been from India is because there were advertisements that were placed in newspapers for runaway slaves. So when slaves ran away from their masters, the master would very often put a advertisement in a local newspaper, for example, in Virginia, saying that, my slave has run away, and anybody who finds the slave will be given a reward of $25 or $50, whatever the case might be. And some of these advertisements mention slaves who are East Indian. And this is what, of course, makes one think that it's very likelihood that these were people actually from India. They have Christian names, so they don't have identifiably Hindu names, but they have Christian names because they would have been converted. And it seems that there were certainly more than a handful of them in the United States in the second half of the 18th century, moving into the first half of the 19th century. Right? And then you have these occasional Lascars, of whom we're going to say a great deal more when we begin to look at how these people, in some sense, moved into places like Harlem. You know, the reading that you have by Vivek Bald, which is for next week, gets into some of that terrain. All right? So this is roughly the territory that I've covered so far. Now, before we get into sort of, you know, this history proper, beginning, as I said, in the 1890s, there are a couple of other considerations. And one of those considerations has to do with the presence of Asians as a whole, not just Indians, in the United States. All right? Because there is obviously an earlier presence of Chinese and Japanese in the United States, and we know. And again, if you look at the, you know, the short book that I've done, I mean, I even have a very, very short segment there where I really speak about some of the forms of discrimination that were already starting to become prevalent by the 1870s and 1880s against the Asian presence. By 1882, there are about 300,000 Chinese in the United States already. All right, 300,000 Chinese. They constituted 10% of the population of California, and a significant number of them had been brought over to work on the railroads. All right? So there is going to develop shortly thereafter, and the bulk of these people are living on the West Coast, there's going to develop a violent anti-Chinese movement in San Francisco. And then you have, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is going to bar Chinese laborers for 10 years, right? So they're barred from coming into the United States, Chinese laborers, for 10 years. In 1892, when the act is going to expire, it is going to be renewed, right? And in fact, in 1902, when it's, so another 10 years later, this act is going to be made permanent, and it is not going to be revoked until 1943. Right? So keep that history in mind. And why 1943? Some of you might have surmised, of course, because the U.S. is, at this point, at war, right? There's a Pacific War as part of what is called World War II, and the U.S. is obviously at war with Japan, and nationalist China is obviously an ally of the United States. So you can't really, you know, be an ally with nationalist China and at the same time deny Chinese from entry into the United States. So obviously it was a political and diplomatic embarrassment of the highest order, you know, not to mention ethical problems with these kinds of positions. So obviously in 1943, this act is going to be finally removed, and it's going to permit the entry of the Chinese Exclusion Act is going to be revoked, and it's going to permit their entry. Now the other dominant Asian group, this is before the Indian presence starts to be felt in the United States. And when you hear the numbers, you'll immediately come to the awareness that the Indian presence is really minuscule compared to the Chinese presence and the Japanese presence. Remember, 300,000 Chinese in the United States, principally in California, by 1882. Now, in the case of the Japanese, between the 1890s and, let's say, about 1920, early 1920s, about 275,000 Japanese have immigrated to the United States at that point in time. One thing to bear in mind is that Japan was, by the early 20th century, a world power. Right? It's a world power, and that's something that the United States has to keep in consideration, because if you're going to have policies that are hostile to a certain immigrant group, and that immigrant group belongs to a country which is a considerable power, then it obviously has political, economic repercussions, right? And how is Japan a world power? In 1905, it defeats Russia in a major naval battle, right? And its navy is certainly going to be reigning supreme over the Pacific, all right? 1907 is the heaviest year of Japanese immigration into the United States. You have about 31,000 Japanese who enter the U.S. that year. And now, by way of comparison, let's take two comparisons here. So 31,000 Japanese entering the United States in one single year in 1907, right? Well, that's greater than the total number of Indians that had immigrated to the US before 1947. Okay? Before 1947, I'm not talking about how many Indians there were in the US in 1947. I'm talking about the total number of Indians who had ever come to the United States. That was less than the 31,000 Japanese who came in one single year in 1907. The other comparison, if that 31,000 seems like a huge number, is 286,000 Italians, people of Italian origin, came to the US that year. Okay? I mean, if you look at the Ellis Island records, I mean, and people who have done immigration history, because those were the heaviest years of migration from places like Italy into the United States. Okay, so even that 31,000 number is really dwarfed by people who are coming from places such as Italy. All right. So keep this in mind, because these are the two different, other immigrant Asian groups that we are speaking about by way of a comparison. All right. Now let's go back to the history of Indians in the diaspora. Okay. So when is the first influx? The first influx dates to the 1890s. Okay? And they're essentially coming not to the US directly. They're coming to the west coast of Canada, because there were no direct sailings, actually. You couldn't get on a ship at Calcutta and take that ship to the west coast of the United States. You would have to go to Canada, and usually that meant you went to Vancouver or maybe some other part of British Columbia. Right? And then from there, some of these people would eventually make their way down by land, crossing the border by land, into the United States. Right? And what have they come to do in Canada? And who are we speaking about? We are speaking about Sikhs largely, a few Hindus. Although I must say, by the way, that if you look at early immigration records, and if you look at the literature, it very often talks about Hindus coming to the United States. Hindus was the generic category for Indians. Okay? Because I don't think anyone in America would have known the distinction between a Sikh and a Hindu. Now, you have some scholarly work being done on India at that point in time, but it's absolutely minuscule. I mean, it's minuscule. And of course, scholarly work that was being done on India at that point in time had to do entirely with ancient Indian history and culture. It had to do with the holy books, with the scriptures. I'm using Western categories here, scriptures and so on. But the sacred or religious literature of the Hindus, including the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, that is what was being studied insofar as anything was being studied in the United States having to do with India. Sanskrit was beginning to be taught, right, in the United States at places such as Harvard, right, and Johns Hopkins University. Right? So I'm speaking here about the last quarter of the 19th century. Right? So we might think today, we go back to that time and we say, oh, there was a huge amount of ignorance, but this ignorance was arising out of the fact that, as I said, there really was almost no understanding of what India really meant and what was its history and culture, other than this small segment of the religious or sacred literature of the Hindus, right? Which had already, as I've indicated to you, started to be translated now for a good 100 years at this juncture. All right? So when we look at the 1890s now, what we're speaking about is people who are starting to go to Canada. And what are they going there for? They're going there basically as farmers, and they're going there as lumbermen. As you've got a lumber industry, right? And they're basically going to be working in the lumber industry, or they're going to be working as farmers. Now, this is not to say, by the way, that Canada was extraordinarily hospitable to Indians. I mean, no one should be under the illusion. One narrative that Canada has very successfully circulated to the rest of the world for the last 150 years is representing it itself as a beacon of liberal thought, quite unlike the United States, this, imperialist empire, and then you have these quiet, gentle Canadians. Well, they were not quite gentle Canadians. I mean, in 1907, Canada is going to bar all Indians from entry. There were, of course, laws already pertaining to barring the Chinese and the Japanese and so on. It's just that the Canada essentially devolved a policy, if I may put it in the simplest and harshest terms, devolved a policy which said that let America do the dirty work, we'll just continue with our good reputation. All right? That's essentially been the policy of Canada for a very long period of time. But certainly in the 1890s, the doors were somewhat open. You could go there. And then from there, as I said, you essentially made your way down. If you felt that, well, life in Canada was not quite what you wanted to move to the United States, then you slowly made your way down the coast and you started working in places such as Washington, right? The state of Washington, which is where the first anti-Indian racial riot is going to take place in 1907 in a town called Bellingham, right? All right, and so essentially we're talking about farmers and lumbermen. That's one constituency, largely Sikhs, some Hindus, but they are referred to in the literature as Hindus, particularly in the United States, because as I've said, there's really no distinction made at this juncture between the Hindus and the Sikhs. And the matter must have been confusing, particularly because many of the Hindus who came at that time, coming from farming communities, they wore turbans too. They were not quite like the turbans that the Sikhs wear. But they did wear turbans, some of them. So this would have obviously compounded the error from the, looking at it from the American side of things, where it became very difficult to distinguish between the two. Then you have another constituency. A little bit later, just a little bit later, students. And where are they coming to? Not UCLA at that point in time, because UCLA has not been founded. It's going to be a bit later. Berkeley. UC Berkeley, a technical institute which still exists. It's now part of the Cal State system. The technical institution being at San Luis Obispo. Right? So you've got some Indians who start to come to the West Coast, and they're coming for graduate studies. They're not coming for undergraduate degrees. Okay? So this is the trend, of course, that's going to exist until very, very recently, until let's say 5-10 years ago, when virtually all the Indian students who came here, with one exception here or there, would have been always students coming for higher degrees, for doctorates or for MDs or professional degrees. All right? So you've got this small constituency. So, all right, now we're going to add a few more constituencies down the years, but at least in the 1890s, moving into the early 1900s, these are the constituencies that we're talking about. Now let's just look at a few numbers. Okay, we don't want to do too much number crunching, but just to give you some idea of how many people are we really talking about, over here, right? So between 1901 and 1910, there are going to be 5,800 Indians, approximately, who are going to enter the United States. Only 109 of these are going to be women, right? So again, highly skewed female-male ratio, right? As it was in places such as Trinidad, Guyana. Think about that context over there, all right? And I want to remind you of that other diaspora again now at this juncture, because an interesting thing is happening. In the 1890s, right, one of the things that's happening is that in South Africa, in the 1890s, early 1900s, the first decade of the 1900s, Indians in South Africa are now being mobilized by Mohandas Gandhi to wage a struggle for their rights. Okay? And of course, one of the reasons why Mohandas Gandhi and others have to wage this struggle is because there are attempts being made to deny Indians their rights there, including laws having to do with barring Indians from owning property, barring their movement. Things that I've spoken to you about, that there were severe restrictions on the ability of Indians to own property in places like Natal, in the Transvaal, right? And other places in South Africa, where you were now beginning to get some Indians, in Johannesburg. Okay? So, there you've got these restrictions. The US is relatively open at this time. Relatively open at this time. There are no laws barring Indians from coming into the United States in the 1890s or early 1900s. Right? So you have to link these two histories together. I'm not saying, by the way, that it's the same people who would have gone to South Africa who now start to come to the US. I'm not making a direct correlationship of that sort, but I'm saying that if you were to do a global history of the Indian diaspora, you would begin to see there are these simultaneous flows, right? And then try to understand what the connection might be between some of these simultaneous flows, right? And of course, the same history that you have in South Africa at this point in time, 1890s, 1900s, is going to be replicated in the United States shortly thereafter, when there will be restrictions placed on the ability of Indians to enter the country, own property, so on and so forth. All right, so that's keep that part of the history of the diaspora in mind. All right, now before we begin to try to unravel some of this history, one further context has to be added. And that context is what's happening in India at this point in time. Surely that's important, right? There are people coming from India to the United States. Why are they coming here? Same question that we might want to ask. For example, we asked this question regarding the Indian indentured laborers. Right? And we said that, well, one of the reasons why the Indians are being lured to go to Trinidad or Guyana or wherever is because of the fact that the economic conditions in India are extremely oppressive. And so there are some people who are certainly leaving of their own accord. There are others who are lured into leaving or deceived into leaving. But the gist of the matter is that you have a huge number of Indians who leave. Now, some are going to start to come to the United States at this point in time. Right? And we don't really know, frankly, very much about exactly how is it that an Indian sitting somewhere, in a small village or a small town even heard of the United States. Right? I mean, were there recruiting agents, for example, for these farmers? We know almost nothing, frankly. Nobody's, was doing oral histories at that time, so we don't really understand fully the circumstances under which they came. The idea of America as the land of immigrants, the land of milk and honey, if you were an immigrant, all your desires in life could be satisfied by coming here. Well, was this idea prevalent in India? Were there people in India who were really in the know about it? Right? We don't really know much about that at this juncture. And of course, the numbers are not very big. But there is one consideration we do know about, and that is that nationalism was becoming a potent force in India. In 1885, the Indian National Congress has been founded. Now, at this point in time, it's a small organization comprised entirely of lawyers, highly educated lawyers, and they're making relatively modest demands. More Indians should be represented in the government, so forth and so on. Nobody is demanding independence as such, certainly not in the Indian National Congress. But within 10, 15 years, the picture begins to change. It's moving very fast. The scenarios are unraveling. And what's happening in part is you have Indians who are now beginning to say that, well, we're going to wage an armed struggle against British rule in India. And of course, the colonial state is going to hound them. It's going to start persecuting them, finding them, running after them, right? This is the context that's important, because some of the people who are going to come here are people who are revolutionaries. Whether they're real revolutionaries or self-styled revolutionaries is a distinction that we need not worry about right now. But these are people who can certainly be viewed as nationalists, right? And they're escaping the persecution of the colonial state in India, and some of them are going to come to the United States. Most of them are educated. They're well read in what you might describe as revolutionary literature. Right? So that's going to be another constituency. Their numbers are going to increase gradually, and you're going to hear very shortly a narrative about these people. But this is another constituency that's coming, and what I'm describing for you is a scenario in India, right? So in the Punjab, we know that there was this Land Alienation Act that was passed, and what this Land Alienation Act did was it made it very difficult for Punjabi farmers to be able to sustain a living. So that's one reason why Punjabis are leaving. Because who are these people? As I said, Sikhs. And if they're Sikhs and some Hindus, they're coming almost entirely from the Punjab. Okay? Right? The same people, by the way, who had gone to Kenya to work on the railroads. Right? And the same people who, in the narrative I had for you last week, are the ones who are going to go to places like Southall. The Punjabi we're now working with a subnational category. We're no longer working with this category called Indian, just for the sake of this argument. And I want you to keep this in mind, because one of the things that we must do when we look at the Indian diaspora is to also look at its constituent elements. The Gujaratis and the Tamilians and the Punjabis are quite different, you know. Yes?
Can you say the name of the act again? The act they were persecuted by?
The what, sorry? Punjab Land Alienation Act. Land Alienation Act. Okay? Right? So there's this whole story that has developed around the Punjabis of people who are eminently diasporic. You recall that little quip that I mentioned to you in Indian diasporic studies. There are two things that are found all over the world, right? A potato and a Sikh. Right? These people are highly mobile. They'll go anywhere. You know, I recently came back from a trip to Tanzania where I gave a paper on Punjabis who've been buying up land in Ethiopia like crazy. I mean, you're talking about, 250,000 hectares of land, which is being sold at ridiculously low prices. Okay, and who are the ones who are going there? It's the Punjabis, you know, right? Okay, so it's that part of the story which is a separate one than the overwhelming story of the Indian diaspora, is that, you know, you can think of constituent elements such as the Punjabis and their particular role in this diasporic history. All right? So we have identified a working class, peasants and lumbermen. We've identified students. And then we've identified a third group, and we can describe them as revolutionaries or rebels or political dissenters, right? Who are now making their way into the United States, 1890s, moving into the first and second decade of the 20th century, right? And I was giving you these numbers. I'd begun by saying that 5,800 immigrants coming between 1901 and 1910. Just by way of comparison, by the way, from 1871 to 1899. 1871, well, scattered one or two Indians here or there, because really, you know, they start coming in 10s and 20s and 30s in the 1890s only. But between 1871 and 1899, you have 491 Indians. We have a precise number because of census figures, right? Of course, there may be a few people who are not recorded, but you're talking about 500 roughly, right? So very, very small, minuscule, right? And then even between 1901 and 1910, only 5,800. Now, the interesting thing is that, as I said to you, 1907, you have a racial riot against Indians. So now we have to start to think. In Bellingham. Now, and if you read the newspaper headings at that time, by the way, some of this stuff you can now find on the internet. Some of these newspapers have been scanned, okay? And I want to just give you the titles. It's from my own book. So page 20 here. These were some of the kinds of newspaper headings that you find 1907 to 1910. Quote, "The West and the Hindu invasion." Hindu invasion. Okay? Right? I mean, you begin to think, like, what is this Hindu invasion? I mean, are we speaking about millions of these people coming in to the U.S., right? This is from a journal called the Overland Monthly, 1908. Hindu invasion, Collier's Magazine, 1910. And quote, "The Hindu, the newest immigration problem," journal called Survey, issue of 1910. The newest immigration problem. That's interesting, right? Because the person who's writing that obviously thinks of each group as creating a problem. And, you know, whenever any group, immigrant group comes in, it's a problem. And then you have to find a solution to that problem. The solution, of course, is either you throw them out, but you can't do that with all of them because, of course, America is a land of immigrants. And the other thing is you try to integrate them, assimilate them as quickly as possible. Make sure that that they get rid of their dirty habits. Because, of course, the assumption was all of these people are coming with dirty habits. And vis-a-vis the Indians, by the way, this, you know, there are literally dozens of articles which are going to represent them as having dirty habits. They're cooking curry, of course. This is a common complaint, and therefore there's, you know, a smell there which seems unrecognizable, so forth and so on. Substantial sort of series of complaints of this kind that you're going to find all the way from 1907, 1906, moving into the 1910s. And some of these complaints, by the way, are going to get embedded in government reports because they're official government reports now on, you know, these immigrant groups and what are their customs and habits and manners like. All right? Now, it's very interesting to think about this for a moment because, I have very often argued, for example, with respect to Indian history, that there have been groups in India. A good example would be the Parsis. So who are the Parsis? The Parsis are these Zoroastrians who came to India 1,000 years ago. Okay, and they came to India 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago, when Islam started to become dominant in Iran, right? And some of these people then fled to India, right? And India, even today, has the world's largest Zoroastrian population, but they're called Parsis in India, right? And then, of course, the other group that we can be thinking about is the Jews, right? If you look at the scholarly work of, let's say, Joan Rowland, I'm just going to mention two scholars if anybody is interested in this. Joan Rowland, the other is Nathan Katz. So Nathan Katz wrote a book published in 2000, and the book is called Who Are the Jews of India? And one of the arguments that he makes is that India is the only country where you do not find any evidence ever of anti-Semitism. Absolutely no record. In fact, the Jews were received hospitably, they were given land grants, okay, so forth and so on, right? And the only other country which in this sense may be close to India in terms of its hospitality to Jews is China. It's the only other country we can think of, okay? In Europe, of course, the history is quite the reverse, a constant history of anti-Semitism, so on and so forth. Right? Now, why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because I want you to think of what's happening in the US. Right? I'm mentioning it because very often the argument is made, well, the reason why the Parsis and the Jews were never really, discriminated against is because they were such minuscule numbers that it didn't really matter. Right? I mean, the Jewish population today, by the way, has declined to 5,000. I mean, literally 5,000 out of 1.2 billion, but at one point we were talking about tens of thousands. We were talking about 40, 50, 60,000. And notwithstanding the fact that it was very small numbers, it was a highly educated and significant community. The Parsis, larger than the Jews, we're talking about several 100,000, right? But I think I may have mentioned, I can't recall in this class, that in fact the city of Bombay, right, was to some extent the work of the Parsis. They had a huge role in the building of the metropolis of Bombay. Right? So they're very small numbers as well. Now we're talking about, in the United States, we're talking about, literally a couple of hundred Indians. And you begin to see these newspaper headlines. Hindu hordes, right? Hindu invasion, right? The newest immigration problem. Right? So I'm saying that we would have to confront a central problem in American history. There's no going away from it. And that central problem has been that even though the US defines itself as a land of immigrants and open to others, immigrant groups have largely had a very uphill struggle. Yes?
Wait, so you said between 1901 and 1910 there are only 580?
No. Total number is 5,800, the number of Indians who have come.
Oh.
But not all of them are going to stay. There are also Indians who are going back. Okay? There are also Indians who are going back. So this 5,800 is the total number that have come. Right? I mean, in Bellingham, Western Washington, where the racial riot took place, we're not talking about thousands of Indians there. We're talking about a few hundred. At most, in this one little town, at most. Okay? And yet you have a severe problem, which leads to, as I said, the first recorded instance of a racial riot against people of Indian origin in the United States. All right? Now, moving into then, 1907 is a year also when, as I pointed out to you, Canada is going to begin to restrict the entry of Indians. So what you're going to have is that Indians who formerly would have been going to Canada as well, they're going to start coming to the United States. And that's why in the last 2-3 years, from 1908 to 1910, the number of Indians coming to the United States is going to accelerate, in comparison to previous years. All right? So as we move into the second decade now, the most interesting phenomenon there is basically what is called the Ghadr movement. Right? And I want to spend a bit of time on this movement. The number of people involved in it is not very large, but it is an extraordinary narrative of a very transnational kind of political movement. It's what I, in the book, refer to as a diaspora within a diaspora. Okay, so who are these people involved in the Ghadr movement? What does the word mean? It's revolution. Okay? That's what it means. And this is a revolutionary party. What is its membership? Its membership is made up of these rebels, dissenters, right, who have fled the United States, India, some of them, right? And they want to create a political movement which is going to agitate for the end of British rule in India. But they're going to do it from the US. Right? Because, as I said, India had become too hot for them. It's become difficult for many of them to live in India. Some of these people have already moved around. Right? There's a scholar by the name of Benedict Anderson. And about 30 years ago, one of the arguments that he made was, it's an argument that frankly everybody knew about, but he crystallized it in a different way, what he calls long-distance nationalism. Right? And all of you are familiar with the phenomenon. Once you're told about it, you may not have thought about it consciously, but it's this long-distance nationalism. A very good example of that would be the Irish living in the United States, in places like Boston on the East Coast, who were the greatest supporters of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. Right? And so when in fact, in Northern Ireland itself, let's say, and in the Republic as well, some of the support for the IRA might have diminished, it certainly did not diminish over here among the Irish, who were zealots, absolute zealots when it came to the cause of Irish republicanism. Right? That's what we call long-distance nationalism. Now, long-distance nationalism obviously has its advantages, it has its hazards as well. And very often it's been argued that one reason why people can be so zealous, have such zeal about their nationalism when they're doing it from a long distance, is because in some ways they're not accountable. They don't have to pay the everyday price that a nationalist may have to pay, where you might get hounded, your family might get hounded, your property may get confiscated. You're an Irish here, you're living here for 5 generations, your family's been living here, you left after the potato famine, you don't have any property in Ireland, you can be an Irish nationalist, not really have to worry about the consequences, right? But this is not that kind of long-distance nationalism we are talking about here. So we have to be very clear here. One of the things that Benedict Anderson talks about is that in this long-distance nationalism, a set of nationalists, very often elite nationalists, not always, but very often elite, meaning that they come from either the upper strata or are highly educated, that they created these nodal points around the world. And they would go from one place to another, sort of fomenting revolution. And what were these nodal points? London, Paris, New York, Vancouver, San Francisco. Okay? These people, and a few places in Asia, among them Hong Kong and Tokyo. Okay? So these are some of the nodal points. These Ghadarites are to be found in all of these places. They have created a kind of a transnational network. And what does this transnational network hope to achieve? It hopes to achieve the liberation of India from British rule. In 1913, they set up a party, the ones who are in the United States. Okay, I would refer you to my own work here, pages 26 to 27, where you'll find a short account. There's a book that has come out on the Ghadr movement, quite an interesting book. It's by Maya Ramnath. Do not recall it from the library, please, because I have it checked out right now. Okay, it's called From Hajj to Utopia, and it's really a full-blown account of sort of the Ghadr movement. What were these people doing? All right, so there's this party that is set up. It's called the Hindi Association of the Pacific Coast in 1913. Right, and there are going to be a number of groups that are going to spin off from this, and these people are going to start to, among other things, publish a journal, right? And this journal, incidentally, is going to be published in 4 languages. right? I mean, that's quite what today would be called multicultural. I don't think any of them was thinking that they're multicultural, but that's what these people were doing, because they were aware of the fact that you have to have literature available in a number of languages, because the revolutionaries themselves belong to disparate groups. I mean, as I said, they're largely educated, but they belong to different linguistic groups. Bengali, Pashto, English, some of the languages in which some of this literature is being made available. And once you start look at this, you begin to really marvel at their grit, ambition, right, and desire. Now, some of them may have had ideas which were not workable. So one of these ideas was that you try to achieve the liberation of India from British rule through the use of armed force. Right? Through the use of armed force. This is before, by the way, Gandhi has come back to India from South Africa and brought his ideas of nonviolent resistance, which is what he's going to be known for, right? Because Gandhi is going to return to India in early 1915, and it's going to be several years before he establishes himself as the chief architect of Indian independence. So these people are not reacting to Gandhi. They're not reacting to Gandhi. This is happening here in 1913. Right? And they're very clear in their mind, because they think that the Congress party back in India is a constitutional party, that the Congress party is not going to be able to deliver India from British rule. Its ambitions are modest, its means are exceedingly modest. Right? So if you want to liberate India from British rule and you're just a bunch of people, well, how are you going to do it? Well, one of the things you do is you try to create links with the Germans. And of course, British intelligence in India is trying to track these people down. They're taking up they're trying to work with their counterparts, right? At this point in time, America doesn't really have, what you might describe as intelligent services, right? Intelligence services, right? You don't have the CIA and FBI. It's not become a national security state at that point in time. It's going to take a few more decades before that really begins to happen, right? But nonetheless, they're going to seek the assistance of officials and authorities in the United States to track some of these people down. And there's going to be these incredible plots that these Ghadarites are going to hatch. Really half-baked plots, such as smuggling arms into India, okay, with the help of the Germans. Virtually none of this is going to come to fruition, right? The movement is going to last only a few years. So if you're trying to, gauge the success of the movement by the outcome, well, there's really not much to write about. But you cannot gauge it by that. You have to gauge it by what this history represents. Think of it, right? Armed revolutionaries trying to free India from the yoke of British rule, working from the US, from Vancouver, from Tokyo, creating a transnational network, publishing a newspaper in several languages. This is 100 years ago, right? Without internet, without any of the kinds of contrivances that you would think of today. How did they create this kind of transnational network? And it got the British worried. I mean, there's this man called W.H. Kerr who writes a book called Political Trouble in India. Right? And then in this book, Political Trouble in India, he sort of gives you histories of all the revolutionaries in India and abroad who are creating trouble for the British in India. And these Ghadarites get substantial mention there. The British are concerned. All right? So what is it that the Ghadr movement represents? So here's from page 27. This is from the masthead on one of the issues of their magazine called Gadar, and this is from the inaugural issue, which was published from San Francisco, November 1st, 1913. By the way, the headquarters of the Ghadr party can still be seen in San Francisco. It's like a little museum. It's always closed. The inefficiency continues 100 years later, if I may put it this way, right? So if you ever go there, I've made 4 attempts to see it, but it's always shut down. But it's there, and the masthead, right? Okay? So this is what the masthead says. What is our name? Ghadr. In what does our work consist? In bringing about a rising, right? Socialists are very good always at these things, these slogans, with the raised fist, right? Where will this Ghadr break out? In India. When will it break out? In a few years, Right? Why will it take place? Because the people can no longer bear the oppression and tyranny practiced under English rule and are ready to die and fight for freedom. It is the duty of every Indian to make preparations for this rising. Yeah, this last few sentences are kind of prosaic. I mean, I think they should work with these little slogans, 4 words, 5 words. That works better, you know. It is a duty of every Indian to make preparations for this rising. It's like making preparations to cook a dish or something, you know, right? Right? But this is the aspiration, right? Make revolution, do the slogans. As I said, if you look at the plots, I mean, they're like chicken feed. Comes to nothing, frankly. Okay? But it's the aspiration, the vision, the dream. That's what's important. The fact that they were able to create this transnational network. And that's what I call the diaspora within a diaspora. Have a few dozen people, maybe 100, 200 sympathizers maybe, here and there, scattered all over the world, somehow being able to maintain this link, this network, right? Working in several languages. Now there's a section of the newspaper, it's called the wanted section, okay? And they publish this little tidbit. I'm quoting once again. Wanted, revolutionaries, right? Job, to launch Ghadr, a revolution, right? Pay, martyrdom. Pension, liberty, right? Look at the imagination, you know, that's what makes it interesting, right? Pay, liberty. Field of battle, Hindustan, India. Right? So this is what this movement is. Now, these people are going to, 1913, inaugural issue, 1917, a trial in San Francisco. The Ghadr conspiracy trial. Takes place in a court. Right? And that's pretty much the end of the movement. I mean, now it survives in the minds of academics like myself, right? And others who are kind of interested in the history of revolutions in the last 100, 200 years, you know, what did the working class do, right? That's what it survives as. Because this Ghadr conspiracy trial, why did the United States, by the way, permit this trial? Interesting question to ask. I mean, there are legal questions to ask too. Because question is, if they're being tried in the United States, they're being tried in a district court in San Francisco in 1917. The trial is going to last several months. Right? It's a long, protracted trial. The government is going to bring, you know, lots of witnesses. Have they broken the laws of the United States? Right? And the U.S. will have to claim that they have. Because otherwise you can't really try them. They haven't broken, you know, if they haven't broken the laws of the U.S., you can't really try them in the U.S., right? And these are not exactly Nazi war criminals that you're talking about, right? So the U.S. is going to claim that they have broken the laws of hospitality, that they were allowed to enter, the U.S. was hospitable to them, and then, and of course this is where the precise infraction of the law takes place, that these Ghadarites have collaborated with Germany, right? And of course, that's the enemy. They've collaborated with the enemy, so therefore they're your enemy as well. Right? And therefore, they can be put on, simplifying it, of course, greatly, since we're not looking at the trial record and, you know, all the intricate details here. But essentially, they're going to be tried on charges of sedition and treason. Right? So this is going to put an end to this movement in 1917. All right, so we've come from about 1890s to 1917. And let me add a little part of the story now, which is going to take us to the next segment of this chronological narrative of the early history of Indians. And that is that from 1900, there are a number of Indians who are also going to be denied entry. So between 1900 and 1907, 45 Indians are going to be denied entry. From 1908 to 1911, 1,600 Indians are going to be denied entry. Okay? And 1908 to 1920, 3,453 Indians are going to be denied entry. So in other words, when they arrive, you know, the immigration inspector says, sorry, you're not allowed entry. In Canada, for example, the reasons for denying entry initially had to do with the fact that they also had a monetary requirement. So every immigrant coming had to have a certain amount of money. You know, it could be $5 or $10. You know, usually it was a relatively small sum of money. Or that they were carriers of disease. or they had filthy habits, or filthy political thoughts, if I may put it this way. That's going to become another pretext eventually, right? These are going to be some of the pretexts on which these people are going to be denied entry. So we are saying that even when immigration is continuing into the US, there's also people who are going to be denied entry. And that is a history of every immigrant group. That usually does not get recorded by the official historians of immigration, because they're only looking at the people who are coming in. It's only the dissenting historians who are going to say, well, if we had this idea of America as a land that was open to everybody, well, let's also think about the people who were not permitted to come in. Okay? And there were always substantial number of peoples who were denied entry. Right? So I've given you the figures here from 1900 to 1920. Okay? Now, we can track this officially through legislation. Right? So I have already indicated to you that there was legislation going back to 1882, which had to do with the Chinese Exclusion Act, where Chinese laborers were going to be denied entry. And that this act is reinforced in 1892, at the end of 10 years, again in 1902, and then in 1902 it's actually going to be made permanent until 1943. Right? But there are obviously exclusions that are going to be put into place against the Indians. However, before we do that, let us just go back for a second to the larger context. This is a slightly different context, and that context is the history of naturalization and the idea of citizenship in America. Right? Because I want to be certain that I don't think it's necessary to reinforce this, because I think you all know it casually in some fashion or the other, but I don't think we should simply reinforce the idea that it was only the Indians or the Chinese who were facing these disabilities. Right? These kinds of disabilities are being faced by a great number of people. In 1790, naturalization by law was limited to free white persons in the United States. Okay? So if you were black, you could not be naturalized. You couldn't become a citizen. Okay? And if you were a white convict, you could not become naturalized. The phrase is, naturalization is only open to free white persons. All right? And then, of course, at the conclusion of the Civil War, shortly thereafter, you're going to have a constitutional amendment, and in 1868, all persons born in the US were citizens regardless of race. In 1868. So if you were an African American or you were a Chinese, in 1868 you would not have really had any Chinese, maybe a scattering at best. And again, the Indians would have been that, a few here and there, you could count them probably, on the fingers of both of your hands, right? So irrespective of race, in 1868, all persons born in the United States would become citizens, which is the law of the land down to the present day, right? That if you're born in the US, you're automatically a US citizen, right? And then in 1870, naturalization is going to be granted to persons of African descent. So naturalization is at this point now white persons and people of African descent. It's restricted at this point in time to them, right? And then gradually, through constitutional changes, other groups are going to be added on. All right? So keep this in mind when we now begin to look at the exclusion of Indians and what the Indian response was. So one of the most interesting aspects of this history is that by 1907, 1908, so 1907 is the year of the Bellingham racial riot, okay? And you could also say that it is a year because now Canada in this same year has barred entry to Indians, so therefore immigration to the West Coast, the focal point of that shifts from the Pacific Northwest down to California. Right? California is now going to become the major influx point. All right? And one Indian response is going to be, mull over it a bit, very interesting. One Indian response is going to be to claim that they are white. That they're white. No, by the way, of course, that that's why that early history, which I've just given you tidbits of, that Africans could be, people of African descent could be naturalized as well. So why are the Indians not claiming to be black? You know, why are they not claiming to be black? I remember when I first came to the US in 1976, and I did my first kind of road trip, okay, from Washington to New York. So not a huge road trip, and but a few hours. And I was with a couple of Indians, and we got into this heated exchange in the car. And that heated exchange was, suppose you were an Indian living in the segregated South in the 1940s, right, when you had Jim Crow laws. And when you had these Jim Crow laws, you know that you went to a restaurant or you went to a bathroom stop somewhere. So it would say for whites only and for blacks only. Negroes, colored. Technically the word that would have been used would have been coloreds, for coloreds only. So let's say you are an Indian, you arrive at a gas station. Well, you're neither of the two. Where would you go? Unless you went behind the bush, right? Which they do in India quite often, right? So where would you go? We got into this heated exchange, right? And because one person said, well, Indians really should view themselves as blacks. The should is the imperative word. They should. Why should they? Out of reasons of political solidarity. Of course, no Indian would want to do that. And the reason you wouldn't want to do it is a pragmatic reason, number one. The pragmatic reason is that in the US, frankly, being an African American is a liability for many African Americans even today. So people are not going to choose to go into a group in which membership can be a liability, right? That's a pragmatic angle. So there's an ethical angle. The ethical angle is you should. You should. Why? Because, we're immigrant groups, we're all coloreds, right? And therefore it's imperative that we should do that, right? But it's an interesting question. Where would you go? And of course there were some scattered Indians here and there. Where did they go if they were living in the deep South? I don't know. I haven't seen a single reference ever, in any of this. And of course I'm sure there were only scattered cases. But interesting, right? Hypothetically. Now, let's go back to the question I started, which is I said that one strategy that Indians adopted was to be considered white. So the way this argument is going to develop is they're going to use the category Caucasian, right? You have all heard of this category, Caucasian. And this category comes from the Caucasus Mountains. What is the origins of this? Right, so there used to be government reports all the time and government forms in the U.S. where you would check off Caucasian. We use white today. I mean, if some forms, like you fill out some form of University of California, and they'll usually say optional. Do you want to identify what group you belong to? Are you white? Or, black, Asian American, or whatever it is, right? Hispanic, Native American, right? But Caucasian was a category that was used, right? Where did this category arise from? What does it mean? Of course, the history of this has to go back to the 18th century, when a distinction began to be made between Indo-Aryan languages and non-Indo-Aryan languages, right? All of these concepts have relatively long histories in this case, okay? So a distinction was, this is not irrelevant because what we have to understand is, what did this category mean? And were Indians claiming to be Caucasian, or were they claiming to be white, or both? And did the American public as a whole understand these terms to be synonymous? And what about the courts? Did they understand them to be synonymous? Right? That's the context which will lead us to the famous court cases that I describe in my book very briefly, right? Beginning with Ozawa versus the US, and then the Bhagat Singh Thind case of 1923, right? So the context is that in the late 18th century, to make a very long story short, right, there is going to be a distinction that is going to be made by people such as Sir William Jones. William Jones was an Englishman who was a judge in Calcutta. Right? So he had gone from England to Calcutta. He was a judge there in a court. He was also a scholar, fluent in 6 or 8 languages. And if you read his, he writes a little note saying, "My ambition is to study," and then he gives you a list of every imaginable thing, to have complete mastery over the history, geography, culture, literature, topography, cuisine, languages, etc., etc. And then he says, this is very modest at the end of it, right? This is just my modest ambition, right? He wanted to master everything. And one of the things he did was he learned Sanskrit when he was in India. And he comes up with this idea, which becomes basically the bedrock idea of linguistics and a whole bunch of disciplines, that Sanskrit, the ancient language of India, and Greek and Latin are all related to each other. These languages are all related to each other. They have a common source, which becomes known as Proto-Indo-European. Right? So these are what are called the Indo-European languages. Right? And how did people living so far apart, right, have a common source? And it has to do with the fact that, so here's India over here, okay, and then you've got, just call this Central Asia over here, okay, Central Asia, let's just say Caucasian mountains over here, okay, present-day Georgia and former Soviet Union, all of that. There's a group of people here, Aryans, right, and they are going to start migrating. Some of them are going to go to India, some of them are going to go to Iran, and then there's some strands who are going west, okay? And since the Aryans are all coming from one common source, this is giving it to you in the simplest form. There are obvious complications here and there, but right, the Aryans are dispersing all over. And these Indo-European languages, as they're called, right, which include not just Sanskrit and Greek and Latin, but then the languages derived from, let's say, Latin, okay, including the Romance languages, and then the languages derived from Sanskrit, which would include Hindi, Bengali, Oriya, the whole bunch of languages spoken in North, Central India, and some other languages as well. They all have a common source called Proto-Indo-European, right? So the Caucasus Mountains is where the Aryans are supposed to have come from, okay? So this is where the word Caucasian is derived from. So now one strategy was, you needed a strategy. Why did you need a strategy? Because there were already restrictions coming into place, forbidding you from entering the country. And this was not only important for people who were coming from India, it was important for people who were already living here. Why was it important for them? For at least 2 reasons. One, that notice the highly skewed male-female ratios. At some point, most of these men are going to want to get married. Right? And what are they going to do? They're going to want to go back to India, get a bride, and then come back again. But if now there are restrictions on your entry, many of them no longer have this option. They're not going to have this option. You don't want to take the chance. You don't want to leave. Yeah, you want a bride, but if you can't come back, yourself and with your bride, you're not going to take the chance. Right? The other reason why they're, of course, concerned and why you need a strategy to somehow resist this new form of oppression now is that even if you didn't want to go back, you might be ejected from the country. That the rights of naturalization do not belong to you. And if you cannot be naturalized as a citizen, right, then obviously that means you're suffering under enormous disabilities, liabilities. Right? So this is why the Indians are going to have to come up with some kind of strategy. So the strategy they think of, which is, by the way, a strategy not unique to them. I mean, we know that there were Japanese Americans who were trying to do the same thing. They're going to try to pass themselves off as white. But passing off is a related phenomenon. Where this phenomenon has a long history in many cultures. You pass yourself off as something else. So it's partly that. But what we're speaking about here is that it's going to have some teeth to it, which means that it's going to have to have some legal force and eventually be recognized in a court of law. So they're going to say that we are Caucasian. Okay? And I'm really cutting to the chase here because we're not looking at the court case in detail here now. Right? What's going to happen in the 1923 case, which I discuss in my book and which has been discussed in a great many books, is that when this case appears, okay, this case of Bhagat Singh Thind, who had been in the US for a substantial period of time already, okay, had been in the US for a very substantial period of time, right, and he's now seeking to get naturalized and to ensure that he can continue to stay in the US. When the case comes to the court says that, look, you're saying that you're Caucasian, you're saying you're white, because Caucasian and white are synonymous terms. And the judge says, frankly, I have a little bit of a problem. The problem is that no one using their common sense could think of you as white. That you don't look white to me. It's like if I appear, right before the court. My son, who's darker than me, says I might not be the best example. I've passed off as an Italian when I've been to Italy, for example. Okay? But let's supposing you were a shade darker. And the judge says, looking at you, nobody would accept that you are white in the common sense understanding of what it means to be white. And therefore, I cannot consider you capable of naturalization. Right? I'm summarizing it very briefly. Effectively, that's what it's going to come down to. Right? And so this attempt, there are cases, by the way, there are court cases, 1910, for example, 1913, number of years where you have court cases where the court had ruled that the words Caucasian and white were synonymous. So let's make sure you understand what we're saying. What I'm saying is that the court in previous years had ruled in a number of cases that the terms Caucasian and white are synonymous. They mean the same thing. Okay? Because Indians had initially claimed that they were Caucasian. But if the court claims in cases in 1910, 1913, 1915, that these two terms are synonymous, therefore the Indians now think that we can actually claim that we are white. And that's what's going to lead to the Bhagat Singh Thind case in 1923 here. Okay? And of course the Indians felt fully justified in saying they're Caucasian. Why? Because this goes back to the scientific argument about what it means to say that you're Caucasian. In effect, it meant to say that you're Aryan. Right? So the court in 1923 is not saying to the Indians that we don't agree with this, quote, scientific theory. It's not saying anything about the origins of the Indo-European languages and who the Aryans are. It's not saying to Bhagat Singh Thind that you're not an Aryan. The court has no problem if Thind represents himself as an Aryan or as a Caucasian. But naturalization is only available to people who are either white. The law does not say that you are to be Caucasian. It says naturalization is available to you if you are white or of African descent. Yes?
Yeah, but you mentioned the Japanese case.
Yes?
The Japanese person claimed the same thing, but the court had it both ways. Because the Japanese person was white in the skin, but this is not Caucasian.
Yeah. Yeah. But we're not saying that the court is always being consistent and rational. I'm not making that claim. I'm not looking at it with respect to, whether their argument can be sustained vis-a-vis the Chinese and the Japanese, right? I agree with what you're saying. And in effect, it's actually, there were cases, by the way, where literally, the person had to, pull up their sleeve, and then the judge would say, well, that doesn't look white to me. Your skin doesn't really look white to me. Okay? So if you're saying that, look, in the Japanese case, the argument is that, yeah, you really look white to me. but you're not Caucasian. And you're saying that, well, the court wants to have it both ways. Of course they want to have it both ways. Because when you are being racist, you want to have it both ways. There's no question about that. Let's not assume that there is any kind of consistency, except when you're being racist, you want to be consistently racist. No problem. Right? So this is, in effect, what we're speaking about over here. That 1923, what you're going to get is you're going to get essentially a court case which is now going to block the Indians out. Right? So and what you have already, by the way, in California is, remember the Chinese Exclusion Act you've already had? Okay? You've had the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now you're going to get the Indians who are going to be blocked out, 1923, from this case. You already have fairly stringent regulation about the purchase of land. Do Asians have the capacity? I don't mean physically do they have the capacity. Are they permitted to own land or not? Right? Let me go back now a few years, because you already have a couple of pieces of legislation, right, which effectively had already blocked out the Indians. And then you might say, well, why the Bhagat Singh Thind case so many years later, 6 years later? 1917 Immigration Act. Right? So 1917 Immigration Act essentially bars Asians and they're demarcated. They give you the latitude, the longitude, and say people who are living between such and such, areas will no longer be permitted into the United States. This is what is called the Pacific Barred Zone. Okay? Right? But of course, there were Indians here. Now, we're not speaking about the Asians now. We're just looking at Indians. There were Indians who are already living here. Do they have rights of naturalization or not? That's why the Bhagat Singh Thind case is important. That it's not simply a matter of whether Indians are going to be permitted or not to come into the United States. What about the Indians who are already here? 1920, you have the Alien Land Law. And in places like California, it's going to become almost impossible for Asians to own property. Okay? So 1920s, early 1920s to 1940s, mid-1940s, that's a situation we're speaking about. Now, this is where we're going to stop the narrative for today. I'll pick it up from here, right? Bring you up to about 1965, and then we're going to start looking at the questions that you have for week 5. All right, and I wish to remind you that you've got papers due not next Tuesday. It's a Tuesday following the coming Tuesday. Okay, so roughly about 12 days from now.